Hi, it's Rabbi Travis again. Um, if you're observed, and I think most of you are, you'll see some unattractive facial growth. Um, I don't like beards. Um, I have a terrible beard. My wife hates the beard. But I have a beard, or what some might call a beard, because we are in the 3 weeks that lead up to Tisha B'Av. I'm recording this on Tuesday. Tisha B'Av will be Thursday this week. Um, Not shaving is one of the signs of mourning that we observe in the 3 week period that runs up to Tisha B'Av. What I wanted to do today is speak very briefly um, about what Tisha B'Av commemorates, what it marks. I think everyone is aware that our sages teach, and there's historical record to support it, that both the first and the second temple were destroyed on the 9th of Av. There's much writings about it in the Talmud. There are external sources too. The Babylonians destroyed the first temple. The Romans destroyed the second temple. There are records in both cultures about this. The Romans famously, for instance, after the destruction of the temple in the year 68, it took them 4 years to put down the Jewish revolt. Only the Jewish people revolted against the legendary Roman Empire. They had to send their best troops in there, the 10th Legion. It took them 4 years to put down the rebellion. And so the Arch of Titus in Rome commemorates their victory. Josephus Flavius is the full name he adopted. He was a Jew. He was a Kohen, worked in the temple actually. Ended up following the Romans. He wrote about the fall of Jerusalem, the fall of Masada. It was awful. Tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people were killed. The suffering during the siege, both in the fall of the first and second temple, was horrific. Loss of the nation, loss of sovereignty, loss of the temple. Contemporary sources from the time tell us that, for instance, after destruction of the second temple, the slave markets were so flooded that the price of slaves dropped. Famous example of supply and demand. There were just too many Jewish slaves available on the market. Our sages, and if we have time, maybe we will talk about that a little today. Our sages in the Talmud go on at length trying to ascertain the reason that both the first and the second temple were destroyed. Famously, they conclude that the first temple was destroyed because of 3 cardinal sins: murder, idolatry, sexual promiscuity. These are 3 sins that, in theory, one should sacrifice one's life rather than transgress them. The example I always used when I was in the classroom, it's a silly example, but I think it gets the point across. If a madman broke into our class with a plate of ham and cheese sandwiches and a gun, and he said, "Eat or I'll kill you," we would eat. If he broke into our classroom and said, "Here's a knife, kill another person," or if he broke in the classroom and said, "Here's an idol, bow down and worship this idol," in theory, we should sacrifice our life. I say in theory, because no one ever knows what they would do in such circumstances until, God forbid, they find themselves in such circumstances. So we know over the course of history, there have been Jews who gave up their life rather than worship idols or convert. And there are Jews who converted because they didn't have the strength, and we can't criticize them. But we see the rabbinic approach to the fall of the first temple is that the people were, for the most part, not so religiously observant. The book of Jeremiah deals with the run-up to the fall of the first temple, and he sharply criticizes the people for their lack of observance. The second temple is very different. The rabbinic tradition is that the people of the second temple period were faithful in their observance, and their sin was what the rabbis call sinat chinam, which is senseless hatred. And there's an important lesson there. The first exile, The exile to Babylonia lasted for 70 years, even though it came about because of the three most serious sins that there are in Judaism. Again, murder, idolatry, inappropriate sexual activity. The destruction of the Second Temple was caused by baseless hatred of Jews towards one another. This lack of unity, which I think all of us would agree continues till this day, has resulted in an exile that's lasted nearly 2,000 years. Even though there's Jewish sovereignty has been restored over the land of Israel, we're still in exile. The temple has not been rebuilt. The monarchy has not been restored. The ingathering of all the exiles. So the rabbis, again, I don't think we'll get to it this morning, but maybe we will. The rabbis spent a lot of time before coming to those conclusions, arguing what was underlying the destruction and exile, because there's a rabbinic view that punishment comes out, the expression uses midah keneged midah, measure for measure. They very much believe that the crime ought to fit the punishment, and they were trying to ascertain what horrific sins did they do that would justify God extracting such severe retribution, as it were, from the Jewish people. But I want to start off by going through the Talmudic sources that discuss the tragedies that occurred on the 9th of Av in the 3-week period leading up to the destruction of the temple, because there's more during this than just the destruction of the temple. So I'm going to toggle over to the screen so I can look at the source sheet, and we will go through it. There's a long discussion in the Talmud, in the tractate called Ta'anit. Ta'anit in Hebrew means fast. And there's a whole tractate devoted to how the Jewish people should react to national calamities. In biblical times, one of the main reactions was to declare a fast day. And so the tractate discussed when and how and under what circumstances fast days should be declared, how often, etc., etc. And toward the end of the tractate, it discusses this time period we're in. And so it begins by discussing the 17th day of the month of Tammuz. That's the day that begins this 3-week period that runs up to Tisha B'Av. It is observed in our times as what I would call a minor fast day, meaning we fast from sunrise to sunset. It's not a 24-hour or actually a 25-hour fast like Tisha B'Av is, like Yom Kippur is. And let me just state, there's a fundamental difference between Tisha B'Av and Yom Kippur that we sometimes confuse. Yom Kippur is not a sad day. It's a serious day. It's a day to be filled with awe, but it's not a sad day. The end of Yom Kippur, after Ne'ilah, when we believe that God has heard our prayers and forgiven us again and set forth for us another year of good tidings, should be the happiest time of the year, literally. Tisha B'Av is not a happy day. It's a somber, sad day. So let's start. So the Talmudic sages teach as follows. If 5 calamitous matters occurred to our ancestors on the 17th day of the month of Tammuz. The first of which were the tablets being broken. If you recall, Moshe spent 40 days and 40 nights on Mount Sinai. Toward the end of the period, God says, "Get down, your people are sinning terribly." He descends the mountain and finds the golden calf being worshipped. Even though the text reads as if all the people were worshiping the golden calf, there were only 3,000 who did so. All the people are associated with the sin because they could have stopped them and they didn't. Moshe sees this, and there's 2 versions in the Mishnah. One version says the stones were extraordinarily heavy, and only because of the great faith of the Jewish people could he find the strength to hold them up when he saw the Jewish people, or a portion of them, were worshiping the golden calf. Clearly their faith was lacking, so his strength lacked, and they slipped from his hands and broke. The more commonly cited Mishnah is that he threw them down out of anger. but one way or other, um, the first set of tablets were broken. So the Talmud asks, how do we know? Where do we derive that the tablets were in fact broken on the 17th day of Tammuz? So it's taught on the 6th day of the month of Sivan. The Aseret Dibrot, the 10 utterances, were given to the Jewish people. Rabbi Yossi says it was on the 7th of the month. There's a dispute how to count the days. And the Gemara says, so according to the view that says they were given on the 6th of the month of Sivan, they were given on the 6th. And on the 7th, Moshe went up to Mount Sinai. And according to one that said that the Aseret Dibrot, the 10 utterances, were given on the 7th of the month of Sivan, they were given on the 7th. And Moshe also went up the mountain on the 7th of Sivan. So everyone agrees he went up to Mount Sinai on the 7th of Sivan, because the verse says, and he called to Moshe on the 7th day out of the midst of the cloud. This is a verse from Exodus. It's also written, and Moshe entered into the midst of the cloud, and he went up into the mount, and Moshe was on the mount 40 days and 40 nights. So the calculation is as follows. There are 24 days remaining in Sivan, plus the first 16 days of Tammuz, which comes to 40 days. On the 17th day of Tammuz, Moshe descended. He came, he observed the Jewish people worshiping the golden calf, and he broke the tablets, as it is written. And it came to pass, as soon as he came near to the camp, that he saw the calf and the dancing. And Moshe's anger burned, and he cast the tablets out of his hand and broke them beneath the mount. And this shows the tablets were shattered on the 17th day of Tammuz. This is a national tragedy. Second tragedy that the Talmud says occurred on this day. It says the daily offering was nullified. So it's important to remember that there were two communal offerings brought up in the temple on behalf of the Jewish people, one in the morning, one in the afternoon, and even during the siege of Jerusalem, Josephus writes, during the second siege, the destruction of the second temple, that they were able to sneak in animals to offer these, continue with these daily offerings until very late in the siege. So it was on the 17th day of Tammuz that they could no longer get animals into the temple compound, and so they could no longer offer this sacrifice. And this too was a national tragedy. The rabbinic view is that the daily offerings brought atonement for the Jewish people, as the Talmud says elsewhere, that the offering brought in the morning atoned for sins that happened the preceding night. The one brought late in the day atoned for sins that occurred, the people committed during the day. The rabbis taught further. A third tragedy occurred on the 17th of Tammuz, and that is the city walls of Jerusalem were breached. So the Gemara asked, why was this tragedy something that occurred on the 17th of Tammuz? And it asked, isn't it written? We see in the book of Jeremiah, it says in the 4th month, on the 9th of the month, the famine was severe in the city. And it is written immediately afterwards, then a breach was made in the city, which clearly indicates that the wall was breached on the 9th. So Rabbi said, this is not difficult. Here, the verse in Jeremiah refers to the first temple, whereas there in the Mishnah, it describes the destruction of the second temple, as it's taught. Upon the destruction of the first temple, the city walls were breached on the 9th of the month of Tammuz. Destruction of the second temple, the walls were breached on the 17th. Since they were close, 9 and 17, they're a week apart, since so many other things happened on the 17th of Tammuz. So when we make the list of the terrible things that happened on the 17th of Tammuz, we include the breaching of the walls of Jerusalem, even though it was only with the second temple, not the first temple. Another terrible tragedy. The Roman Apostomos publicly burned a Torah scroll. This was the first time that we have in our tradition that a Torah scroll was burned publicly. We have this as a tradition handed down by our sages. There's no specific source, but it was just a well-known fact. And you can imagine how traumatic it was to have a public burning of a Torah scroll. Another tragedy that occurred on the 17th of Tammuz. The wicked king Manasseh placed an idol in the sanctuary. So the Gemara asks, how do we know this? How do we know what happened on the 17th of Tammuz? So that it's written in the book of Daniel. And from the time that the daily offering shall be taken away, an abomination that causes appallment, that is, appallment is depression caused by terror or dismay, is set up. This indicates that an idol was placed in the temple on the very day the daily offering was suspended. So the Gemara goes on and asks, and was there only one idol placed there? Isn't it written further on in the book of Daniel? And upon the wing of detestable things shall be that which causes appallment. Again, this terror by dismay. And so you have plurals of this detestable things. So this suggests there were at least two idols. So Rabbi comments, he said, there were initially two idols, but one fell upon the other and broke its hand. Since only one idol was whole, the Mishnah mentions only that one. And Rabbi continues, and an inscription was found on the broken idol that read, you want to destroy the temple, I have given you your hand. It is though one idol said to another, you are seeking to destroy the temple. By causing Israel to pray to you, I too give you a hand to assist you. It's an important thought here that God gives us free choice. He sets out consequences for misdeeds, but he lets us make our own choices. So here too, something as serious as worship idols, God let the people make their own choices. So that those are the sins, those are the national tragedies that occurred on the 17th of Tammuz, which begins this 3-week period. And the Talmud, again, in this tractate of Tani, continues and turns to the 9th of Av itself. And the first event that our rabbis ascribe to the 9th of Av, it says it was decreed upon our ancestors they would not enter the land of Israel. So we have to remember the story. Jews, in the second year after leaving Egypt, they were on the verge of heading out and entering the land of Canaan, the Holy Land of Israel. Moshe famously sends out 12 spies. The spies come back. 10 of the 12 give an evil report about the land. They included some factual information with the report, but they exaggerated. They said we can't conquer the land. There are giants living there, whereas we look like grasshoppers in their eyes. And the two of the spies, Joshua and Caleb, said, no, don't believe them. We can do this. God has done great things for us. He took us out of Egypt. Remember the plagues with which he struck the Egyptians. Remember the splitting the sea. We can do this. And the people believed the 10, not the 2. And it says that night they cried and they said, woe is us, woe is us, woe is us. And that was the 9th of Av. And the Midrash says God declared, as it were, you want to cry tonight? I'll make this a night of crying to you. So the Gemara asked the question, from where do we derive that this decree that the people would not enter the land of Israel occurred on the 9th of Av? So it's written in the book of Exodus, and it came to pass in the first month in the second year, on the first day of the month, that the tabernacle was erected. And the master said, meaning an anonymous sage said, in the first year after leaving Egypt, Moshe built the tabernacle. At the beginning of the second year, Moshe erected the tabernacle, meaning it was constructed, but it wasn't put into place and used. And he sent spies out, as is written, and it came to pass in the second year, in the second month, on the 12th day of the month, that the cloud was taken up from the tabernacle of testimony. The cloud arising off the tabernacle was a sign that the people should journey forward in the desert. And it's further written in the book of Numbers. It says, and they set forth from the Mount of Lord 3 days' journey. Rabbi Chama bar Chanina said, that very day, they turned away from God by displaying their anxiety about leaving Mount Sinai, as it is written. And the mixed multitude that was among them fell lusting, and the children of Israel also wept on their part and said, would that we were given flesh to eat. It's a famous story that people said they were tired of eating the man, even though the Midrash says it could have tasted like anything they wanted. And the verse says that the Jews ate meat for an entire month. It sounds like a good deal, but as a punishment, they were sick of eating meat by the end of the month. At the end of the month, there was a plague that broke out among them. So this text continues, this Talmudic text continues and says, if one adds to the first 20 days an additional 3 days journey, these are 23 days, and the cost of the subsequent month is, that they were eating had 29 days, and that the journey ended on the second day of Sivan. So we're going to continue with the calculation. After this, the Jews travel to Chatzrot, where Miriam was afflicted with leprosy. Another famous story, she and Aaron were discussing Moshe. The story is that Zipporah, Moshe's wife, was chatting with Miriam. They were friends. After there was Moshe, by lot, chose 72 people to become part of the Sanhedrin. Only 70 could serve, so 2 remained behind in the camp. And the text of the Torah says they prophesied in the camp. And then Midrash says Miriam exclaimed, "Oh, woe to their wives," because when Moshe, after he descended from Mount Sinai, he separated himself from his wife because he was on call, as it were. And he felt that if he were sexually intimate with his wife, he would have to go to a mikvah, to a ritual bath to purify himself before appearing before God. And so the Midrash continues that Miriam and Aaron, who were both prophets, said, "Really? We're prophets, and we haven't separated ourselves from our spouses." And at that point, God called all 3 of them. And Miriam, who didn't say anything literally false about Moshe, our sages call this avak lashon hara. It was the dust of gossip, nothing really not true. And she was afflicted with what is commonly called leprosy, but sara'at, as it's described in the Torah, is not leprosy. It's a skin affliction, white skin, but it's not leprosy, but it looks like leprosy, so that's why it's easier to translate as leprosy, but we'll call it sara'at. She got it because she initiated the conversation, not Aaron. Anyway, long background story. So the verse, getting back to our discussion, says Miriam was set outside the camp for 7 days till the sara'at passed, and the people didn't travel until she was brought back in again. Include these 7 days. They remained in Chatzerot until the 29th of Sivan before they traveled to Paran. And it's written right after that, send your men that they may spy out the land of Canaan. And this calculation is taught. On the 29th of Sivan, Moshe sent the spies, and it's written they returned from spying out the land at the end of 40 days, which means they came back on the 9th of Av. So they added up. But they asked, wait, if you do the math, the remaining days of Sivan, the entire month of Tammuz, the 8 days of Av, it's 39 days, not 40 days. So there's a debate in the Jewish calendar when we declare the month. Sometimes it's 29 days, sometimes it's 30 days because we follow the lunar calendar, and you can't have a month with 29 and a half days, which is really what the cycle is. So some days it's 29, some days it's 30, and that's how it balances out. So Amaya said, no, that year, the month of Tammuz was full. It had 30 days. So that's how we get to the calculation of 40. So we'll set aside the math, and so we'll get back to the text. And the text says, all the congregation lifted up their voices and cried, and the people wept that night, as I had previously mentioned to you. Rabbi said that Rabbi Yochanan taught that night was the ninth of Av. And the Holy One, blessed be he, said to them, you wept needlessly that night, and I will therefore establish for you a true tragedy over which there will be weeping in future generations. So this is what our sages say is the first of the tragedies that happened on the 9th of Av. Clearly and arguably the most severe of the tragedies, because an entire generation was condemned to wandering 40 years in the desert, an additional 38 years because this happened in the second year, and all the men above the age of 20, other than Caleb and Yehoshua, died in the desert. And so this set the template for the 9th of Av. So they continue in the Talmud. So the temple was destroyed for the first time on the 9th of Av, and they explain as is written. And I'm sharing all this with you because we see that the sages took this very seriously, this tradition they had about all these things about the ninth of Av, and they brought proofs to show that this is what really happened. So the proof about the first temple is as follows. It's written in the Second Kings as follows. In the 5th month, on the 7th day of the month, which was the 19th year of the king of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylonia, the captain of his guard, Nebuzaradan, a servant of the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem, and he burnt the house of the Lord. It is also written in the 5th month, on the 10th day of the month, which was in the 19th year of the king of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylonia, Nebuzaradan, captain of guard, who served the king of Babylonia, came into Jerusalem, and he burnt the house of the Lord. So, this is difficult. You can't say, it's impossible to say the temple was burned on the 7th, as it's already been stated in Jeremiah that it was destroyed on the 10th. It's also impossible to say that it was burnt on the 10th because it was stated that it was destroyed on the 7th in the 2nd book of Kings. So how do we reconcile this? What really happened? So the Talmudic sages say on the 7th of Av, the foreigners entered into the sanctuary. And on the 7th, on the 8th day, they ate there, they desecrated the sanctuary. There's a long-standing tradition that they fornicated in the Holy of Holies, in the presence of the Holy Ark, to show their disdain for it. On the 9th of the month, right before, late in the day, close to nightfall, they set fire to the temple. And by the way, let's back up for a second and recognize that the temple was largely made out of stone. Stone typically doesn't burn. There was wood there. It's enough wood to catch fire, but the fire was so intense that the stones burned and were scorched. And so, this is part of the view that this was a heavenly fire. God let the Babylonians and later the Romans be the vehicles through which he brought destruction to the temple. But were it not for God's assenting, this could not have happened. So they set fire to it late on the day of the 9th. It burned continuously for the entire day and into the next day, as the verse says, "Woe unto us, for the day has declined, for the shadows of the evening are stretched out." So this verse is interpreted as a prophecy about the evening when the temple was burned. And this is what Rabbi Yochanan meant when he said, had I been alive in that generation, I would have established the fast only on the 10th of Av, because most of the sanctuary was burned on that day. And the sages who established it on the 9th, what did they say? Their argument was, it's preferable to mark the beginning of the tragedy. So there was a discussion. Should they decree the fast day on the 9th when the fire started? Should they decree it on the 10th when the fire largely burned for the first temple? There was even a view that suggested maybe we should fast for 2 days, for the 9th and the 10th. And the sages said, no. People can't fast for 2 days. It's too much to ask. So, but this is how they reconcile the date as being the 9th of Av. Again, you had conflicting sources, 7, 9, 10. So again, they entered the sanctuary on the 7th, desecrated it on the 7th and 8th, started the fire on the 9th, it burned to the 10th, and they picked the 9th day of Av because the fire was started there. And we have a tradition that says that the second temple was also destroyed on the 9th of Av. So the Gemara asks, how do we know that? So it's taught a meritorious matter is brought about on an auspicious day, and a bad matter, a harmful matter, is brought on an inauspicious day. In other words, so when we have a day that's known for a festive day, good things have happened on that day. So good thing, that's when other good things happen. And when you have a day that's known for being a day when historically bad things have happened, more bad things happen. So that's the underlying assumption here. In the 9th of Av already has had the people decreed in the desert that they should perish in the desert. The first temple the fires were started, so the destruction of the first temple is linked to the 9th of Av. So the sages continue in their discussion of the second temple. So they say when the temple was destroyed for the first time, that day was the 9th of Av, and it was the conclusion of Shabbat. And it was a year after a sabbatical year. Sabbatical year is when the every 7 years, the people let their fields lie fallow, and there's to show that the land belonged to God. And just as there's a Sabbath every 7 days to recharge, so too there is on the Jewish calendar. And it was the week of the priestly watch of Joharib, and the Levi'im were singing the song and standing on their platform, which is remarkable that they're still trying to have the temple work as usual, even though the enemies are in the gate and there's fighting all around. And what song were they singing? They were singing the verse, and he brought upon them their own iniquity, and he will cut them off in their own evil, which is from the 94th chapter of Psalms. And they did not manage to recite the end of the verse. The Lord our God will cut them off before the Gentiles came and conquered them. And likewise, the same thing happened when the second temple was destroyed. So such Talmudic passages, I just want to say, I don't know that we need to take them literally. It's hard to imagine that the Levi'im were standing the platform and trying to go about their business as if nothing was going on when there was fierce fighting going on all around them. But it's trying to emphasize the point that God's hand were behind it, that they would have been singing, and he brought upon them their own iniquity, and he will cut them off in their own evil. Okay, so there's no verses that show that it was literally on the 9th of Av, but again, you have a long-standing tradition. There were historical sources, and there was this belief that a day like the 9th of Av, bad things happen on the 9th of Av. It continues further that Beitar was captured on the 9th of Av, and they know this by tradition. Beitar was a major city, and it fell during the Bar Kokhba rebellion. The Jewish people, you would have thought after the temple was destroyed and the Romans exiled them, and they left a remnant behind in Jerusalem, that the Jews would have learned their lesson. But they didn't. And in the year 131 of the Common Era, Bar Kokhba began a rebellion. He was supported by the famous Rabbi Akiva, and the rebellion lasted 4 years, just as the first rebellion did. And the Romans had to send in their best troops, as they had to do with the first rebellion. And the final battle occurred at this fortified city of Beitar. The tradition teaches that 80,000 Jews were slaughtered on that day. The oral tradition says that the Romans did not allow them to be buried, but their bodies did not decompose. And ultimately they were allowed to be buried, but God performed a miracle. But the fall of Beitar was a huge tragedy. It marked the end of the second rebellion against the Romans. There's another, excuse me, the source here continues. It says Jerusalem was plowed under. And again, some historical background. So after the second rebellion, the Romans were pretty disgusted with the Jews, and and they wanted to. They had it, and so they banned the study of Torah. They really cracked down on Jews. They banned Jews from going to Jerusalem. They changed the name of the city. So this is the historical context for this Talmudic teaching. So it's taught when the wicked Turnus Rufus plowed the sanctuary, a decree was issued against Rabban Gamliel, who was the leading sage at that time, for execution. A certain Roman officer came and stood in the study hall and said quietly, "The man with the nose is wanted. The man with the nose is wanted." It was a hint. Rabban Gamliel stood out in his nose. The imagery here is like the nose protrudes from one's face. Rabban Gamliel protruded. He stood out from everyone else in his generation. So he heard this. He went to hiding. So the Roman officer came and found him where he was hiding, and he said to him, "If I save you from death, will you bring me into the world to come?" And Rabban Gamliel said to him, "Yes." The officer then said to Rabban Gamliel, "Swear to me." He swore to him. The officer went up to the roof. He fell and died. And the Romans had a tradition that when they issued a decree and one of their advisors died, they would cancel the decree. So the officer sacrificed saved Rabban Gamliel, and a divine voice emerged and said, "That officer is designated for life in the world to come." The sages taught when the temple was destroyed by fire for the first time, many groups of young priests gathered together with the temple keys in their hands. They were, just as Jerusalem Today has gates. The old city, these gates date to this time. So they had keys to the gates. And they ascended to the roof of the sanctuary, and they said before God, Master of the universe, since we did not merit to be faithful treasurers and the temple is being destroyed, let the temple keys be handed to you. And they threw them upward, and a kind of palm of a hand emerged and received the keys from them. And the young priest jumped from the roof and fell into the fire of the burning temple. There are lots of stories that talk about the Jews sacrificing themselves rather than give in to their captors. There's stories of young men and women who were taken on ships to be sent to Rome to become slaves that threw themselves overboard. It's reflective of the suffering that they our sages see that went on during this period. There's a last teaching in this train of thought. And the prophet Isaiah lamented over them, meaning the priests who jumped off the roof after throwing the keys towards heaven. The burden of the valley of vision. What ails you now that you have all gone up to the roofs? You that were full of uproar, a tumultuous city, a joyous town, your slain are not slain with the sword, nor dead in battle. This is referring to young priests who died by throwing themselves off the roof into the fire. And even with regard to the Holy One, blessed be he, it is stated, for it is a day of trouble and of trampling and of confusion for the Lord of hosts in the valley of vision. Isaiah continues, a shouting over walls and a cry to the mountain. This verse indicates that even God shouts over the destruction of the temple. So this notion that the 3 weeks are just a bad time, a tumultuous time, continues. It's known, for instance, that the Crusades, the First Crusade period, when entire communities, great communities of Worms and Mainz were wiped out by the Crusaders in Germany, they took place during this 3-week period. The tradition teaches that the expulsion from Spain, when the Jews were given in 1492 the choice convert or die or be exiled, then half the population, the estimates are, decided to leave, which is an impressive number, but then again, half didn't leave. That's a long discussion maybe for another time, but tradition teaches that it was on the 9th of Av when this decree took place. I remember learning that Columbus was supposed to set out for the New World on the 9th of Av, and he writes in his diary, the day of his scheduled departure, he couldn't leave because the ports were filled with ships leaving. It's the day the Jews were going out. And so this 3-week period is a serious period. It's a somber period. It's a period where our sages say, don't do business during this period. Don't enter into business, especially with non-Jews, because your business ventures won't succeed. This is just a dark time for us. Conversely, we say, for instance, the month of Adar, the month of Purim, is a festive month. We say when the month of Adar enters, joy and happiness enter with it. And so too, the 3 weeks leading up to the 9th of Av, which again falls out Thursday of this week, dark times, as it were. So the Gemara concludes this discussion of the 9th of Av, and it prescribes for us, excuse me, I'm sorry, what we can and cannot do during this mourning period. So the sages taught that all the mitzvot practiced by a mourner are likewise practiced on the 9th of Av. So these are, we cannot eat. We're talking a mourner, not during the whole week of Shiva. We're talking about the leading up to the funeral, the day of the funeral. We don't eat, we don't drink, we don't anoint our bodies with oil, we don't wear shoes, but shoes really mean leather shoes. That's why you'll see people wear sandals or sneakers. Some people wear slippers on Tisha B'Av. We're not intimate with our spouses. We don't read from the Torah or from the books of the prophets or from the Ketuvim, books like Psalms or Proverbs or the Song of Songs, etc. Or we don't study from the Mishnah, from the Gemara, from the Midrash, books of Jewish law, and not even the books of Agadot, which are Mishnah and the oral tradition. So this prohibition is going to continue. It says, and I say you don't read from the Torah. We do read from the Torah in our services in the morning, but it means you don't study. Tisha B'Av is not a day for studying. It's a day for introspection. We recite things called kinot, which are liturgical poems of mourning. And so this Talmud continues. One may read from a place in the Bible that he's unaccustomed to reading, meaning it'll be difficult for him. He'll not derive any pleasure from it. He may likewise study from a place of the Talmud that is he's unaccustomed to studying. He may read from the book of Lamentations, Eicha, which is our tradition. We read that the night of Tisha B'Av. May read from the book of Job, which is a dark book in its own right. If you've never studied it, it deals with the topic of suffering. From the evil matters in Jeremiah, that is the prophecies of doom. Jeremiah wrote the book of Lamentations, which is a hard text. He describes the terrible things that happened during the siege. There's 5 chapters. The 3rd chapter is his own personal lament. He's the only prophet who prophesies the destruction of the temple and lived to see it. And the book of Jeremiah can be equally dark. So school children interrupt their studies for the day because this is stated in the 19th chapter of Psalms. The precepts of the Lord are right, rejoicing the heart. And when you're sad, you don't study. Rabbi Yehuda says, one may not even read from a place in the Bible that he's unaccustomed to reading, nor may one study from a place of the Talmud that he's unaccustomed to studying, which is our custom. However, one may read from Job and from Eicha, Lamentations. He may read the dark parts of Jeremiah. And school children interrupt their studies, again, because it says, the precepts of the Lord are right, rejoicing the heart. So you see that, and by the way, the practices that are akin to mourning don't apply just to the day of Tisha B'Av, but they apply to the run-up of the period. So there's different customs. Some people, and I follow this custom, don't shave the entire 3 weeks because mourners don't shave. I will tell you, I never fully understood why we don't shave until my father passed away. Before my father passed, even though I have a terrible beard, I hated shaving. I skipped shaving whenever I could, much to my wife's dismay. I didn't mind not shaving during the 3 weeks. I was even strict during the period between Pesach and Shavuot, the counting the Omer. Some have the custom not to shave, and I didn't shave during that period either. Since my father's passing, it's emotionally difficult for me to have a beard. I feel a little bit like a mourner, but I'm strict during the 3 week period. Some people only stop shaving from the first day of the month of Av. From the first day of the month of Av, the 9 days, which many of you may have heard about, our custom is not to eat meat. Our custom is not to do pleasurable bathing, which would mean not to swim, not to take a long, luxurious bath, but you could, of course, wash, especially in a climate like Atlanta where it's so hot and muggy. If we didn't shower, we would all stink. Many people don't listen to music during this 3 week period. There's a discussion in the legal codes. Is it only live music? Can you listen to recorded music? But the bottom line is this is a sad period on the calendar. There are few true sad periods on the calendar. To mention to you, for example, Yom Kippur is not one of those sad periods. Tisha B'Av is. So I hope this background gives you some insights into the day. I was taught by my teachers, you never say to a person, have an easy fast. And the purpose of fasting is not to be easy. Better to say, may you have a productive fast. That the day be a productive day, a day that we can contemplate, reflect upon our standing as a people, what we can do as a people, as individuals and as people, to overcome the senseless hatred that led to our exile, that still contributes to our being in exile, because if we can achieve the proper sense of unity among Jews in our communities and around the world, we will be able to bring about the end of this exile. So again, I'll say to you, those of you who fast, may be productive fast, those of you who don't fast, and there are all kinds of reasons, health reasons, especially during a time like this of a pandemic, where there are leniencies not to fast, whatever your custom and practice is on this day. I hope it's a day of insight and contemplation for you all, and I'll speak to you all soon. Be well. Bye-bye.